The Prime Minister has offered Army Reserve support, Navy ships and planes to assist firefighting efforts. The announcement comes as New South Wales, Victoria and South Australia deal with deadly fires, flaring today under dangerous conditions. Since September, millions of hectares have burned, hundreds of homes destroyed and at least 23 people killed. 2 of those deaths confirmed today in a fire still burning on South Australia's Kangaroo Island. At least 100,000 hectares has been burnt on the island, including most of Flinders Chase National Park on the island's west. Across the border in Victoria, a state of disaster has been declared for large parts of the northeast and the Gippsland region, where 10 emergency level fires are currently burning and more than 100,000 people have been told to leave. There are grave fears for 21 people who are missing in East Gippsland. 2 people in Victoria are confirmed dead. In New South Wales, a state of emergency is now in place and 5 emergency warnings have been issued. High temperatures, strong winds and low humidity will persist into the evening and could make conditions worse than what we saw on New Year's Eve. National Affairs correspondent Greg Jennett joins us live now from Parliament House for more on the additional support that is being sent to fire zones across the country, just announced by the Prime Minister. Greg, talk us through the key announcements today.
Yes, well, 23 deaths and communities mourning up and down the east coast of Australia, down to Tasmania, across South Australia and Western Australia as well. Selena, it was always going to draw a response, a significant one, and that is probably the best description of this ADF commitment and also water bombing commitment that the Prime Minister and the Defence Minister Linda Reynolds has outlined today. So, first of all, as you mentioned, up to 3,000 Defence Force reservists, Army members, will be available to be called out compulsorily by the Chief of the Defence Force. This is after the Governor-General signed an order to authorise that. There are also going to be additional aircraft that include Chinook helicopters, multi-role helicopters, Spartan surveillance planes, C-17 Globemaster cargo planes, some of those pre-positioned into the East Sale RAF base there in Victoria. And then there are these civilian leases coming as well for 4 water bombing aircraft. Some of those are expected to be delivered and in operation by the states within 7 days, we're told by the Prime Minister. But Selena, enough of my description. Why don't we hear from Scott Morrison directly, the way in which he outlined this extraordinary, we're told unprecedented domestic call-out for civilian purposes of the ADF Reserve.
The Governor-General signed off on the call-out of the Australian Defence Force Reserve to surge and bring every possible capability to bear by deploying Army Reserve brigades to fire-affected communities across Australia. I want to stress that the Australian Defence Forces have already been out there, as you saw in great measure yesterday in particular, through the evacuation work that you've seen through the work of the Chills. But I would say, as I've seen in many places, whether it has been on search and rescue, whether it's been surveilling the fire front and providing the planning and coordination information, whether it's been providing catering and accommodation support, clearing roads, our Defence Forces have been out there for many, many months. And what this means is we will be deploying those more on a move-forward basis and taking on these additional reserves, which are being called out as a result of the decision we've taken and authorised by the Governor-General today.
Prime Minister Morrison there speaking in just the last half hour. Greg, also amongst that announcement, the inclusion of HMAS Adelaide joining the resources for evacuations.
Yes, it's been fully stocked with tons of supplies, we're told, Selena, and it will sail from Sydney Harbour down to stand offshore, somewhere around Eden and the New South Wales-Victorian border, awaiting further instructions because, of course, the very large ship that people would be familiar with, the Chills, is already ferrying people out of northeastern Victorian coastal communities. They're carrying about 1,000 at a time. time, which would suggest that there are at least 2,000 people known to be stranded and requiring evacuation by sea in northeast Victoria. So the Adelaide will support that task, but of course, being in that location, Selena, it will also be available to help out if there's any further trouble. It's so windy and hot in southern New South Wales right now. Indeed, in Canberra too, I can report after attending the Prime Minister's media conference, 40 plus degrees, very windy coming off the snowy mountains. That will have offshore winds and other impacts for Merimbula, Eden, Bermagui, Tartara, all those far south coast communities of New South Wales. So the Adelaide will support that. Of course, it has clinical support, it has food and other supplies to do that ferrying. One other thing that I haven't mentioned so far, Selena, there's military bases as well. It's not exactly been explained what role they'll play, but we did hear from Linda Reynolds and the Prime Minister that many military bases stretching from Queensland down to Victoria will become de facto shelters for evacuees and the stranded. So usually, there are large sheds and other accommodation facilities on these bases. They're going to be flung open, or portions of them, so that they can accommodate and support unfortunate victims of these fires.
Yes, and Greg, also the National Recovery Agency, that being established with the idea of being able to assist in obviously what eventually is going to be an enormous recovery operation.
Yeah, and so central coordination becomes all important here. It's the scale of it all which is truly mind-boggling here. We've seen it in the micro before around Innisfail and the cyclones that have struck Queensland before, once upon a time, many years ago. Peter Cosgrove, before he became Governor-General, had a role in those sorts of task forces. Canberra had one, of course, after the bushfires that ravaged this city. But this is much larger on scale because it spans all of those communities, stretching again from Queensland down to Victoria and across to South Australia. So no one, I think, would argue the fact that the Commonwealth, the national government of Australia, is best placed to do coordination that stretches resources across so many jurisdictions, so many states. And so the true workload of this task force, I guess, is still being assessed and mapped out, but its formation is at least the first indication that the government has an eye not just to getting through the next 24 hours or the next 3, 4 or 5 weeks. This is about the many months and years of rebuilding, of income support and other resources that only the Commonwealth can muster and that communities need so badly.
Greg, finally, the Prime Minister again questioned about his relationships with the premiers, particularly the New South Wales Premier, with regards to these announcements of more resources. We saw him again questioned about the timing of this.
Right, so the question that was put to him, Selena, carried an inference or a presumption that the New South Wales government had somehow been causing frustration to the Morrison government, the national government. That is to say that Canberra had wanted to disgorge resources and support to the state of New South Wales, but that somehow there was resistance or reluctance to accept that. Now, I can't verify that. I heard it in the question. It's obviously sourced from somewhere. It may, if it did come from the Commonwealth, and we're not saying that it did, it may in part explain why they're trying to now counteract the perception that they were too slow to move, that Canberra could have done more and should have done more earlier. If there is a view, and it's only if there is a view in the Morrison government that they were trying to, but the states wouldn't let them, then I suppose that was given an airing in that question. However, the answer, just to complicate matters a little, Selena, the answer didn't give any succor to that presumption at all. Scott Morrison merely accentuated the positive and said that he respects no one more than Shane Fitzsimmons and Gladys Berejiklian, of course, as the Premier of New South Wales. So he's heaped praise on all concerned, not just that state, but also Victoria and South Australia too. So it was inferred, but we just can't say that there is validity or what the source was of that accusation that somehow New South Wales had been putting the shutters up to assistance coming from the Commonwealth.
Indeed, and for the people that are out in the fire grounds, it's more important about the announcement of resources today anyway. So, Greg Jennett, National Affairs Correspondent, do thank you.
Thanks, Selena.